Rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khairil mursaleen Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in amma ba'd. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna sayyidina Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. We want to thank ISGH, ICNA, Islamic Learning Foundation, and Young Muslims for sponsoring this educational program that provides an opportunity for us to better educate ourselves and equip ourselves with knowledge that is important for our lives here as Muslims and important in understanding our history. We don't have a mic for the audience, so if you raise your hand, you may have to speak up. But if I say Hilafa Fudu, Hilafa Fudu, who's heard of Hilafa Fudu? If you've heard of Hilafa Fudu, raise your hand. Okay. Early in our Prophet Muhammad, in his life, peace be upon him, and for those who are not Muslims, it is tradition of us as Muslims to send prayers and peace upon all the prophets when they mention their names. So after you hear us mention Muhammad's name, you'll hear us say peace be upon him. Or you may hear me say sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the translation for that is may prayers and peace be upon him. I'm not sure. I'm assuming Imam Khalid explained that, but I'm reinforcing the explanation. Early in our Prophet's life, a man came to Mecca. Mecca is where Prophet Muhammad was born and raised 1,400 years ago. A man came to Mecca, and some people in Mecca took his daughter. Just took his daughter. And since the man did not have any help or support in Mecca, he couldn't get his daughter back. So you can imagine we have a major problem with human trafficking nowadays and abductions and things like that. A man's child was abducted in Mecca, and since he did not have strong support in Mecca, he could not get his child back. Very shortly after that happened, several people in Mecca got together and they formed a pact, or they formed a union. And that union was called Hilafa Fudu. And this was an agreement that they would look out for the rights and protect the interests of those who were weak in the society and those who were marginalized in the society. And this happened when our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he was very young, maybe 17, 18 years old. So we see that from a very young age, he had a consciousness about helping human beings that were marginalized by society. Now, let me go back further, or let me ask another question. Whenever you pick up a biography on our Prophet, the biography, most of them will begin talking about what? Before you talk about Muhammad, before you talk about the beginning of Revelation, before you talk about his father, if I pick up any biography of the Prophet, what is the first thing it talks about? Anyone? Lineage, but what else? Lineage, but what else? Society at that time, or what we call in our vernacular pre-Islamic Arabia, or Jahiliyyah. Okay, pre-Islamic Arabia or Jahiliyyah. The reason that you begin there is because you have to place our Prophet in a context. And context is important. Next slide. Next slide. What letter is this? You have to respond to me. What letter is this? A. Are you sure? How many of you say A? Raise your hand. Somebody said I. She's thinking way outside the box. How many say H? Raise your hand. Are any of you willing to put your life on that? Or one guy is. One brother back there in the back is. But nobody else is willing to put their life on it. Why? Because we will call this ambiguous. It's not clear. Next slide. What letter is it now? H. Right? Because now we can see it in a context. Right? If we take it out of its context, it doesn't make sense. But if we put it in a context, then it makes better sense. Now, you may not be willing to put your life on it, but you're a little bit more confident now that it's an H than you were earlier, right? Next slide. Now what letter is it? It could be, well, that would be like a scientific name for something, not an abbreviation. But you're a little more confident now that this is an H. What we're going to try to do in the next 20 minutes, however long we have, is place a context for you for the life of Malcolm X R. Malik al-Shabazz. Because if you try to study him, and I'm sure Imam Khalid, I'm sorry I was late today, I lost track of time. I was making sure I didn't end up with an ex, meaning an ex-wife, because I had a bunch of stuff to do for my wife. And one was shampooing the carpets. So I was shampooing the carpets all night, and I had to get up this morning shampooing the carpets. And I looked up, and it was quite late. And I wanted to try to get here to hear some of Imam Khalid's presentation, but I didn't make it, so I want to apologize to you. But so I know that he spoke about some things about Malcolm's life growing up and his parents and other things like that that help you get a context. But what we often do that's a big mistake is we take historical figures out of their historical context. And we try to understand them based on our reality today. And if you try to understand Malcolm X based on our reality today, his life is not going to even make sense to you, even why he's Malcolm X. There's a historical context behind why he has the name Malcolm X and why at that time in history it was relevant. It was historically relevant. Next slide. Now, just very quickly to let you know that there's a long history of Islam in America, especially among those who came as slaves or descendants of slaves. That's very briefly, very shortly, I want to mention to you Omar ibn Said, because we're talking about the turn of the century, okay? So in 64, although it's not exactly there, is when Omar ibn Said died. He was born a Muslim of Futa Toro in West Africa, what would be Senegal today. He ends up in Carolina, and he was sold to James Owens in North Carolina. Right now in North Carolina, there's a masjid built from the ground up called Masjid Omar ibn Said. And it's named after this particular pioneer for Islam in America. And then Salih Ali, he was a slave on a plantation. His owner, James Cooper, wrote he was a strict Mohammedan, right? He didn't know Muslim, and so he just said Mohammedan, right? Abstains from spiritual liquors and keeps various fasts, particularly that of Ramadan. Next slide. All right, now, so I'm gonna take you out of there and I'm gonna jump you way up into the 1980s, okay? And if you know these people or ever heard of these people, raise your hand. Anybody ever heard of Charles Bilal? All right, Charles Bilal, first Muslim mayor in Texas. I bet y'all, some of us didn't even know there was ever a Muslim mayor in Texas. And he was actually the mayor of Kuntz, Texas. Anybody ever heard of Kuntz, Texas? Kuntz, Texas is next to Vidor, Texas. And you ever heard of Vidor, Texas? Vidor is famous for a man named James Byrd, right? And James Byrd was drugged on the back of a truck, and he was decapitated by a supremacist group. And this was in the 90s, okay? Yet right next door to Vidor was a African-American Muslim mayor, the first in the history of Texas. Any of y'all ever heard of Keith Ellison? Right, everybody heard of him, right? Anybody ever heard of Andre Carson? Right? Oh, really? Not that many, right? Well, Andre Carson is in Congress just like Keith Ellison. And he's the second Muslim congressperson in the history of the United States of America that was public about it. That was public about it. Okay? Muhammad Ali. Anybody ever heard of Muhammad Ali? All right. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Ahmad Rashad? All right, next slide. Barack Hussein Obama? Anybody ever heard of Imam Wazir Ali? He opened up the first voluntary mosque on a military base in the history of the United States of America. And when he was asked why he was opening up a mosque on a military base, he said, if my sons ever get drafted into the United States military, I want to make sure they can practice their religion while they are soldiers. Okay? Abdul Rashid Muhammad, anybody ever heard of him? He was the first Muslim U.S. Army chaplain. The reason I took you way back to the 1800s and up to present time is to show you that before Malcolm X there's a context, and after Malcolm X there's a context. Islamic history in America among indigenous Muslims does not begin with Malcolm X, and it does not end with Malcolm X. Malcolm X was just one piece of the puzzle, a major piece, a historically significant piece, but you have to put them in his context. Just like the THE, there's a T before the H and an E after the H, and you can only see the complete picture if you see the whole word. As you study Malcolm X, don't pull him out of history and sit him on a page, get all excited about him. Malcolm X this, Malcolm X that, Malcolm X this, but don't pay any attention to what he was encouraging, any attention to what he was preaching, any attention to what came before him, or any attention to what came after him. Only when you see the complete picture will you understand his context. Next slide. How many know Shaquille O'Neal? Yeah, Shaquille O'Neal's a Muslim. Yeah, he is. He's planning to make Hajj. Yeah, yeah. How many heard of Imam Wazir Muhammad? Imam Wazir Muhammad was a top advisor to Malcolm X. Top advisor to Malcolm X. Malcolm X mentioned it. Yeah, he's the child of Elijah Muhammad, yes. So you should know that. Any of you heard of Imam Siraj Wahaj? From New York, right? Directly influenced by Malcolm X. You know? Next slide. Next slide. Turn to the 20th century, right? Darwin. How many of you heard of Charles Darwin? I want you to read what Charles Darwin wrote. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace savage races throughout the world. Any of you heard of social Darwinism? It's from this type of thinking that social Darwinism is born. Okay? At the same time, the anthropomorphous ape will no doubt be exterminated. Okay? The break between man and his nearest allies will be the wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as the baboon, instead of now as between the Negro or the Australian and the gorilla. So here is Darwin comparing blacks and Australian, Aborigine Australians. How many of you even ever heard of Aborigine Australians? All right, good job. Okay, because some people don't know there was people in Australia before it was colonized. Right? So here is Darwin, one of the major thinkers that spawned the whole theory of evolution, which influenced generations upon generations of biologists, stating that one day Caucasian will be closer to the ape than they are to the Negro, putting blacks and Aborigine Australians in the same class as apes. Okay? And Darwin's thinking goes on into the 21st century. Next slide. And I'm trying not to be hyperbolic. Hyperbolic just means you exaggerate something to try to make your point. I'm trying not to exaggerate. I'm trying to be as real as possible. Before 1859, before Darwin's origin, Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. Charles Darwin was a Christian missionary, really. Originally, he was going to be a Christian missionary. Then he went on a tour. And all you who study biologists, you know this. And he went to the Galapagos Islands. And when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he saw the birds, the ferrets, I believe they were. And some had longer peaks and others had shorter peaks. Then from this experience, he came about with the whole idea of evolution, right? But before Darwin's work, many scientists had questions whether blacks were of the same species as whites. But they had no scientific basis for that notion. Darwin stated that African Americans could not survive competition with their white near relations, let alone being able to compete with the white race. According to Darwin, the African was inferior because he represented the missing link between the ape and the Caucasian. Now, you are looking at me in shock. You are. People are looking at me, hey, this is real. And these are some of the attitudes that informed attitudes that were prevalent at the turn of the century. And you will not understand Malcolm X. You will not understand his rhetoric. You will not understand why his message appealed to people until you understand the attitudes that was prevalent at that time. Next slide. How many of you ever saw this picture? What is that, right? What is sitting in the middle of there? A human being that was what? Burned. Now, if you look at the people around them, they look like they're the photo op, don't they? Do any of them look sad? They got smiles on their face. They're profiling for a picture with a dead, burnt human being in front of them. Now, if I showed you this picture and told you the people back there were evil, would it be hard for me to convince you of that? If I said, look at this, look at what they've done, can those people in that picture who are, one guy has the shovel leaning on it, the other guy's leaning down, one's leaning over, nobody's protesting anything. If I said these people were evil, it'd be quite easy for me to convince you of that. I didn't hear you. This is the early 19th, I don't have the exact year, but it's the early 19th century. Okay? Next slide. Lynchings in the South. Victims of lynchings, 1882 to 1968. Where do we live? The dark states are the states with the most lynchings. Where's Texas? Right? Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, Kentucky. The whole South has 160 to 581 lynchings. Okay? The turn of the century, right? Lynching was not illegal in America at the turn of the century. How many of you knew that? It was not against the law to lynch people. I mean, well, technically. But hell, the judge was a KKK member. And even if you got it to go toward the judge, the person he's trying, they're probably under the sheets together. So he's not going to send that person to prison. This is real. Muslims think we got it bad now. We actually think because a little bit of pressure is being put on Muslims and bad things are being said in the media. Oh my goodness, things are so bad for Muslims. Look, man. And then, you know, this guy from Florida who's saying all these bad things about Muslims, and now they got him on all these ads, shocked. It was a time where the governor could say blacks were niggers and apes and animals, and nobody would even bat an eye. And it's only in that context that you'll be able to understand Malcolm X. This ends in 1968. How many of you were alive in 1968? Raise your hand. That means that lynchings, you may have been subject to being lynched. Now, of course, as it got closer to modern time, the ability of you to get lynched decreased, but you were still subject. And see, we don't even have time to talk about Rosewood and what happened up in Oklahoma City, and how whole black neighborhoods and black towns were all destroyed and wiped out and lynched and burnt and killed under the false pretenses that someone in the town had raped a white woman. Now, don't get all nervous on me since I said white woman. That's what happened. A Caucasian woman, they would say that a black person raped them, and then a lot of the men would get liquored up and they go start killing people. I know this seems like something that's only in a movie, but it was a reality at the turn of the century. Next slide. This is something, and you can't see it all, and I'll try to get the slides to you, but all you got to do is Google this. It's all over the internet now. It's not very difficult to get it. All you got to do is Google some of these things. But this was a pamphlet put out by the NAACP. How many of you have ever heard of the NAACP? All right. Called The Shame of America. And this is a propaganda piece. It says, do you know that the United States is the only land on earth where human beings are burned at the stakes? In 4 years, 1918 to 1921, 28 people were publicly burned by American mobs. Go ahead. Huh? I don't know if they were dead or not, but they were burned. I don't know how many of them were burned alive or how many of them were dead when they burned them. The purpose is they were murdered. So even if they were burned after they died, they were murdered and then burned. So it's not like they went and found a dead body, or they went to the graveyard and dug a dead person up, or went to the morgue and got a dead person. No, they abducted someone, killed them, and burned them or burned them alive. Okay? 1928, right? Right about the time that Malcolm Little's parents are at not an NAACP, but at a Marcus Garvey convention from the Garveyites, and they meet, and I'm sure Imam Khalid covered this, they meet each other, Malcolm Little's parents meet each other at a convention for Marcus Garvey. That's where they meet each other, right? 3,436 people lynched, 1889 to 1922. 3,400 people lynched at the turn of the century. And so they were passing in an anti-lynching bill. And it was a debate in Congress of whether or not it would pass. Can you imagine there having to be a debate on whether or not to pass an anti-lynching bill? So now, if you're looking at all this and then you see a young, charismatic person with a bow tie on, clean, telling you, don't look at what they're doing. Look at what's happening to your people. You deserve better than this. You're not an animal, you're a god. You're not the scum of the earth, you're the cream of the earth. You're not close to the ape, you're more civilized than the one that's lynching you, the one that's burning you. It's very easy to get emotion. Look how many Americans have been turned unfavorably toward Islam by propaganda in the media today, and we ain't doing nothing like this. Ain't no Muslims in America burning anybody. Ain't no Muslim in America lynching anybody. Ain't no Muslim mobs running around kidnapping people. None of these kind of things are happening. Yet public opinion has been influenced negatively toward Muslims because of something that somebody from another country did, from the other side of the world, who was over here visiting, was influenced by misguided people in our religion who manipulated their ignorance and played upon their faith and had them commit insane acts, heinous acts, right? And now the whole Muslim American community is suffering the brunt of that. We're being looked at in strange ways because of that. 10 years later, although we're neighbors, we have jobs, we pay taxes, we give civil service, people have known us for years to be peaceful, calm people, yet all of us is being questioned. Now you imagine living at the turn of the century and not just reading about someone being lynched, but that your brother got lynched, or your sister got lynched, or your uncle got lynched, or your aunt got lynched, or some of your friends got burned at the stake. And here comes this young firebrand of a preacher. And see, we don't even really have time to talk about that, because if you don't understand religion in the history of the black community, you're not going to understand Malcolm X. If you don't understand the position of religious leaders and how when blacks denied any other legitimate way to express themselves, began to use the church and religious houses to express themselves. Men who could not become senators, who could not become mayors, who could not become city council people. The only place where they could have any kind of social status, any kind of recognition, was in the church. So the church becomes a very powerful vehicle and avenue by which their voices could be expressed. We don't have time to even discuss that, but just know that religion plays a very large role in the blacks' freedom movement in America. So now, and the president at this time would not even sign this bill. He wouldn't sign the anti-lynching bill because he was afraid of what would happen to his political capital. Imagine that. Now, you knew what you were going to get when you invited me. I can't be all honey on the moon for this, because when we leave, we want you to appreciate what produced a Malcolm X. Next slide. I know we got to stop. Just tell me when to stop. Just give me, you know how to do it. Okay? Now, this is a 19th century Southern Presbyterian pastor. Now, I want you to imagine Hagee. Oh, let me rephrase that. I don't know what will come out of Hagee's mouth. Any of y'all even know who Hagee is? Y'all need to get to know. If you've never heard of Hagee, get to know him. He's a preacher out of San Antonio. Get to know. Yeah. I didn't hear you. Reverend Hagee? Yeah, Reverend Hagee. Yeah. You should get to know these preachers, all of them. Robert Moray. Any of y'all ever heard of Robert Moray? Y'all should get to know Robert Moray. I'll just leave that there because that's not why I was invited for this particular function. But you should get to know some of these leading religious figures and what they're saying about Islam, pro and con, and how they're influencing their congregations. You should get to know them. Any of you ever heard of Reverend Price? Okay. So he said, every hope of the existence of church and state. This sounds drastic, huh? Like, oh my goodness, Sharia is creeping on American law. And if we don't do anything, American law is going to be overtaken by Sharia. Please. American law ain't about to be overtaken by Sharia. But if I make it sound scary enough, I can scare you into believing it, right? So here he's saying, every hope of the existence of church and state and civilization itself, not just America, but civilization, period, hangs upon our arduous effort to defeat the doctrine of Negro suffrage. If blacks vote, the whole world is going up in flames. This is real. Next slide. Next slide. 1865, slavery abolished by the 13th Amendment to the United States of America. So only 35 years before the turn of the century, slavery was abolished. 35 years is not that long. Realize, my fellow Americans, that we are only 145 years up from legal slavery in the United States of America. And I didn't even discuss all the laws pre this, right? Next. All right, so now, here you have all these blacks that were enslaved, then they become free, yet they're still enslaved because they have no legitimate way to earn money, they have no legitimate way to really earn land, they have no legitimate way to get an education, they don't have their own schools, they don't have their own banks, they don't have their own community center. It's not like now. If you're discriminated against now, you can go to the EOC. You can go to the Equal Employment Commission, right? And you can file suit if you're discriminated against. Well, after slavery, you were discriminated against and nobody didn't care. You say, oh, I'm being discriminated against. They say, so what, nigger? So what? So what you're being discriminated against? Right? So the whole question at the turn of the century is, how do blacks get freedom? How do blacks get dignity? How do we have our own human dignity where we can earn a living in a good way for our family, that we can earn land, where we can buy homes, where we can get educated, just get education? This was the whole discussion. And so in the earliest 20th century, you see a birth of intellectuals trying to solve this problem. One is Dr. Wilmot Blyton. Any of y'all heard of Edward Wilmot Blyton? Okay, we got to do some studying for Islam in America. Blyton never took Shahada. Blyton was a Christian. He never took Shahada. He never said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. He never said that. Okay? Blyton, who's considered the father of Pan-Africanism, he wrote a book called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. He published it in 1887. And in his book, he promoted the idea that Islam, a major religion in sub-Saharan Africa, was a more unifying and fulfilling effect on sub-Saharan Africans than Christianity. And he said, which was also a major religion in Africa. The latter was introduced mostly by European colonizers, and Blyton believed it has a demoralizing effect. So here's Blyton looking at the politics of oppression in sub-Saharan Africa, and he sees that at this point in time, Christianity was the religion of the colonizers, and it did not do anything to dignify the indigenous African people. I'm not talking about Americans, I'm talking about Africans. So Dr. Blyton says, look, Africans have to turn to Islam, because for Africans, Islam is a liberating religion, because it's more their own religion. And Edward Blyton is one of the major thinkers that produced the Pan-African movement. And out of the Pan-African movement was born Marcus Garvey. Out of that movement was born Drew Ali. Out of that movie was born Elijah Muhammad. Out of that movie was born the proto-Islamic movements in America that produced a Malcolm X. Malcolm X wasn't studying the Quran in prison and said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. No, Malcolm X was attracted by a political, nationalistic message to uplift black people at that time. The so-called Negro, that's what they said. Your so-called Negro, right? And if it was not for the oppression of blacks, there would be no context for Malcolm X. And Malcolm X did not earn his stripes as a Aqidah pure religious leader. Okay? He cleared his Aqidah up later. Malcolm X got his name as a nationalistic leader, criticizing the atrocious acts that were carried out against African Americans or black people in America, and criticizing Caucasians heavily. That's how Malcolm got his name. Later on, okay, 5 minutes. Later on, well, did that say 5 or did that say 1? All right. Later on, Malcolm purifies his faith. He gets his Aqidah correct. Okay? But that's not how he rose to prominence. He rose to prominence for Muslims like that. Okay? Especially those of us nowadays who don't know the history. We love Malcolm X for that. That's the only thing we know about Malcolm X, is that he went to Hajj, on Hajj, he saw all the Muslims from around the world, and he left the Nation of Islam, and he accepted Islam universal. So we love that, we celebrate that. But that's not his whole story, because he rose to national prominence before that. And he rose to national prominence pointing out the atrocities that were carried out against his people. Okay. Next slide. Marcus Garvey, back to Africa leader, the most widely known of all black nationalists at his time. He's founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and that's where Malcolm X's parents met. How many of you heard of Dr. Sherman Jackson? Okay. Dr. Sherman Jackson, a professor of Islamic studies. He was at the University of Michigan, but I heard he moved to California, right? He got, do you know what university he's teaching at now? He's at USC? Okay, he moved to USC. Dr. Jackson wrote a book called Islam and the Black American, Looking for the Third Resurrection. Any of y'all ever heard of that book? Okay, you should, that's a must read. Even the language, looking for a third resurrection, is a play on a historical context. Because if you don't know the context, tell you black American Islam looking for a third resurrection, you're like, what's this third resurrection stuff about? Well, in the culture of indigenous African American Islam, there's something called the first resurrection. That was when the social movement led by Elijah Muhammad came and cleaned people up off of alcohol, drugs, prostitution, pimpism, but the Aqidah was incorrect. Okay? Then in 1975, his son, Imam Wazir Muhammad, came and he cleaned the Aqidah up. And this was called the second resurrection. The first resurrection was out of savagery, and in his book he's calling for more individuals to get involved scholarly. And for more of the African Americans who are scholarly, who have degrees in Islamic studies from wherever, that they play a more major role in the future of the community. Okay? Yes? Excuse me? Negro is a Spanish word. It's a Spanish word that means black. Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with that. I know that if it's right now, if I say negro in Spanish, that means black. Okay? I'm not sure about that report. Don't call me a nigga. If you step out, I got to cut.
You can go up to 140 and shout.
Okay. If you want to know if it's a bad word or not, call me a nigga outside. Negro? It depends. It depends. Now, again, you have to understand the context. In the, and I'm just having fun. Don't y'all got to loosen up, man. Just relax. I'm not the stereotype you don't have to wear. I'm in a suit. I'm in a tie. I'm a professional. I'm working on my doctorate degree. You don't got to get scared. It's all good. But understand. But again, at that time, to Malcolm, Negro was a bad word, and that's why he would say the so-called Negro. Right? He said, "You're not a Negro." He said, "You're black." And so their whole thing was black man, black pride, be proud of being black. And they considered the use of the term Negro, and Imam Griggs may be able to help us with this a little bit later, because he lived during that time. I'm just reading about it. And many of the others they physically lived during that time. My father knew Malcolm. He met Malcolm. Malcolm came out to Fresno when my father was a minister in the Nation of Islam, and he founded a temple in Fresno. You know, there's messages there now. Malcolm came out. He spent a week out in Fresno with him. Sheikh Talib, the old man who used to come with me all the time, I don't know if you remember, used to be around me all the time, he was very close to Malcolm X, okay? So we know people who actually knew Malcolm X. They're not reading about him in a book. Matter of fact, Sheikh Talib told me, Sheikh Talib was close to Elijah, all of them. He was close to all those people, all those historical figures. So yeah, to the people in the Nation of Islam, Negro was a bad word. To the African-American intellectuals, like a W.E.B. Du Bois, Negro may not have been a bad word, okay? Because that's, go ahead.
No, I was saying because whenever I use it, and I use it all the time because that's how I grew up with, because Martin Luther King used, so I tell
No, today, Negro is politically incorrect. I wouldn't use that. I wouldn't call anybody Negro people today. Nope.
But that means black anyway.
But what is it associated with? That word is outdated contextually for political correctness in America. You don't see any blacks calling themselves Negroes anymore. They're either calling themselves African Americans or blacks. Okay? So again, this is a change. In the 19th,
Negro college, we call it.
the United, well, that's because it's been called that for a long time. All right, yeah, you're right. They should change it. You're right. They should change it. You got me there. Good point. Absolutely. All right, next slide. This is from Dr. Jackson. Okay? No, this is not from Dr. Jackson. This is from. This paper was presented at the 9th Conference of the International Center for Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies, the University of Victoria, March 28, 2008. Here's your reference for it, and I'll give it to the organizer so you can look it up yourself. This is a professional, peer-reviewed journal article. So this is not some guy making up stuff. This is a scholarly take, okay? But Garvey not only preached a message calling for the return of united, liberated Africa, he was also inspired by Islam, the black man's original religion. The Garveyites' hymn for the president stated in its opening stanza, Father of all creation, Allah, omnipotent, supreme over every nation, God bless our president. And this was the Garveyites, okay? And it was these black nationalist movement that led to the pan-Islamic movements, or the proto-Islamic movements for America. In the next slide, Dr. Sherman Jackson will address that. This is from next slide, Dr. Sherman Jackson. No, next slide. This is Dr. Sherman Jackson from Islam and the Black American, Introduction, page 5. I quoted this directly from his book. You can go look it up. Most importantly, while immigrant Muslims might boast a certain chronological seniority, black Americans had established their relationship long before the post-1965 immigrant raise. This relationship went back, in fact, to the early 20th century and the proto-Islamic movements of Noble Drew Ali and especially the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Islam and the Black American, Introduction, page 5. You can go read it yourself so that you can get Dr. Jackson's perspective on it as we quote from his particular book. So he's seen the importance of these proto-Islamic movements that gave birth to Malcolm X. Next slide. All right, next slide. All right, next slide. All right, good. Blacks couldn't find work in the South. So it began a great migration up north. A great migration. From 1900 to 1920, I think 2 or 3 million blacks moved north. Then then it slowed down by the Great Depression. But then after the Great Depression, you saw another wave of blacks move north. Now, they weren't moving north for corporate jobs or lawyers' jobs. They were moving north for whatever job they could get that was much better than their opportunities in the South. Now, when blacks got to the north, they did find better employment opportunities, but they still found an old friend called Jim Crow. How many of y'all heard of Jim Crow? Jim Crow was institutionalized racism and oppression. Okay? So now that blacks have moved to the north, and they had more education, they had more economics, but they didn't have freedom, justice, and equality, this laid the grounds for an explosion of consciousness in the north. And everyone trying to answer the question, how would blacks get freedom, justice, and equality? In stepped Fard Muhammad. How many ever heard of Fard Muhammad? Fard Muhammad is from India. Maybe Pakistan now, but at that time it was India. Huh? He wasn't from Turkey. You should read the works of Dr. Fatima Fanusi. Dr. Fatima Fanusi did her PhD on that whole movement. Okay? Now, he may have come through Turkey, but originally he was from India. Okay? Father Muhammad came and began preaching a very strange form of Islam in the north. Okay? Some believe that Father Muhammad saw blacks being treated bad, and it reminded him of how Indians were being treated in India by the British colonizers. Okay? So he felt some kinship. He empathized with them. So he began to preach this very unique form of the religion that was a mix of mysticism and a whole lot of other stuff. It was proto-Islam, it was pseudo-Islam, it wasn't really Islam. Okay? But he attracted a young man who had a third-grade education called Elijah Poole. Elijah Poole heard his message and accepted it and became his top disciple, and Elijah Poole eventually founded what was called the Nation of Islam. Some people completely dismiss the Nation of Islam and its part in history because of the problems with Aqidah. Okay, if you do that, you'll cheat yourself of understanding the whole history of Islam in America, because right now, America is the largest country in the world. We have the largest number of indigenous Muslims in any Western country in the world. I mean, Muslims that converted here. And a large number of them were a product of the Nation of Islam. Now, before that, up to 1975, yes, there was problems with their Aqidah. But afterward, they were introduced to Tawheed. And that's what's led to this large indigenous Muslim body today. Well, Elijah had a certain appeal, and it was the message of Elijah Muhammad, do for self for black people, that originally attracted Malcolm X in prison. Now, remember all those pictures I showed you? Malcolm's father was killed, right? Imam Khalid, I'm sure he covered that. His father was murdered, right? Okay, all right. All right, you told me 5:40, right? So I'm going to stop at, I'm sorry, not 5:40, 2:40, 1:40. I'm going to stop in 3 minutes, right? Okay. So I got to wrap this up real quick. That message of self-help and self-esteem that the Nation of Islam brought appealed to people. They weren't so attracted to the belief. Well, hell, they were believing a man was God anyway. His name was Jesus. And he was white. The same color the man beating him down, right? And they were waiting for him to come back and save the world, right? So they were already their belief system was already messed up, right? And then Farad comes and offers them something outlandish, that blacks were gods and whites were devils. So Malcolm hears this and he remembers that his house was firebombed. He remembers that his father was killed by whites. He remembers all the pictures that he saw. And he said, I can buy this. I can believe these people are devils. Look at what they do. Right? So he picks up the language of the Nation of Islam and he becomes its most prolific spokesperson in the history of the Nation of Islam. They say that he took the Nation of Islam off the back streets to the forefronts. He mastered the art of media. Malcolm would be coming to a town and he would call the local newspaper and say, you know that X fella? The newspaper would say, yeah, he's going to be in town tomorrow. Right? So he did his own PR, right? Malcolm mastered the dictionary. So you couldn't beat him in a debate because you say a word, you say define that word. You wouldn't be able to define it. Then he defined it, right? Malcolm, with the Nation of Islam philosophy and a dropout, what universities did he go to and debate? Harvard, Oxford, right? He went among the top intellectuals and beat them with with an understanding of our religion that was far deficient than what we have now. Okay? So he rose as a black leader, calling for justice, freedom, equality, do for self, get off of welfare, stop using drugs, stop using alcohol, stop pimping, stop prostitution. If we just took their adab, it was Muslim. It was tight Muslim. Okay? Then later he realized the problems with the aqidah, and he made a personal transformation into where he accepted the universal religion of Islam. Imam Muhammad once said, if Malcom was alive, he would be the leader. Speaking to his community, Imam Muhammad said, if Malcom was alive today, he would be the leader. Okay? But Malcom, Allah decided to take him. Okay? But it was that racism, oppression, abuse, Jim Crow that set the atmosphere to produce a Malcolm X. And when we come back later, we'll talk about what this generation can learn from the life of Malcolm X. But I'm going to make a request to everyone here. Let's just not talk about Malcolm X. Let's have some more forums. And let's talk about Imam Wazir Muhammad. And let's look at the contribution he made to Islam in America. And because he is responsible for the largest group of indigenous Muslims in the Western Hemisphere, period. History will bear that. He took a radical Islamic group and transformed them into a mainstream Islamic group without one shed of blood being dropped. He took people from believing that his father was the messenger of God, that Chicago was Mecca, fasting in the month of Ramadan, and that there was a mothership floating around in space with 24 scientists piloting it that was going to come down and take all the black people and everything else would burn up. He brought all of them to La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. He brought all of them from fasting Ramadan in December to fasting Ramadan appropriately. So let's just not look at the H. We got to look at the T, the Nation of Islam that produced Malcolm X, the H, Malcolm X, and the E, Imam Wazir Muhammad, and that future, and how he transformed that radical group into a proper Islamic community. So I invite the ILF, I invite Masjid Mariam, and I invite all of us Muslims. Let's not just look at one part of the picture. Let's look at the whole picture. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.